All right, yeah, let's get started on this binding. I'll talk very quickly about pre-pressing. What you want to do is press it in half like this and get a nice center crease. Then when you open it up, you're going to take both the top and the bottom raw edges to meet that center crease you just pressed. Press it. And then one more press is at that center crease again, tucking away those raw edges just like that. And we're going to open it all back up and we're going to stitch it into a circle. Make sure you open up all of your binding just like this. We're going to sew it right here. You can sew it on your sewing machine or your serger. It doesn't matter. Whatever you prefer. You can use a 3/8 inch seam allowance if you're sewing the same pattern that I am, which is the 24/7 tank. If not, use whatever seam allowance they have for your pattern. All right, now we're just going to mark it into quarters, just like you would a traditional net band. I already have my center front marked with a little notch. A little tip that I have is anytime you're cutting a pattern piece on the fold, go ahead and mark a little notch. Most of the time you need the center marked while you're stitching, and it helps align all your centers really easily and quickly. All right, here is my main shirt piece. It's this wild cartoon fabric that my daughter likes. We're going to match up the quartered points, and you're going to put the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the shirt. Well, there's several ways to attach binding. This is my personal favorite, and this is the way the tutorial for the 24/7 tank is. I even have different ways in different patterns, but I went with my favorite on this one. So here we go. Just pinning them at the quarter points. Again, right side of binding to wrong side of shirt. The binding is slightly smaller than the shirt, but not anywhere near as tight as a traditional knit neckband. If you're moving from doing regular knit neckbands into binding, you'll notice a difference there. It doesn't stretch as much because the knit band sits up taller than the raw neckline, meaning it needs the circumference of your circle should be smaller than the circumference of the neckline because the neckline is below the knit neckband. Binding, on the other hand, ends up exactly the same as the neckline. So you don't have to stretch it as much as knit binding. Just a little bit, and that will hug the neckline and the arm size or wherever you're adding the binding to the body. If you're doing it like along the hem of a shorts that aren't needing to hug to the body, then you don't need to really stretch the binding at all. If you're doing a neckline or tank top arm size like me, then you'll want to stretch it slightly. Okay, so we're going to sew right here on this first crease. So no matter how thick your binding is, I'm doing the thin binding option on the 24/7 tank. If you're doing the thin or the thick, it doesn't matter. You're going to sew along that first crease. And it's really helpful to pre-press because if you cut anything off a little bit, or if your fabric is stretching, not stretching when you're pressing it, you're still, if you sew along that crease, you're gonna be golden. Okay, so pre-press it. I do give the seam allowances in the tutorial. The thinner binding, you're sewing at 3/8. If you cut perfectly and your pressing lines are all perfect, it should be a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The thicker binding is 3/4 of an inch. So especially when it's like that thicker binding and it's a seam allowance that we're not used to sewing, I rarely ever have used a 3/4 inch seam allowance. It's a really large seam allowance since it's a thick binding. I'm not very good at lining that up on my sewing machine because I'm just not used to it. So pre-pressing will give you a nice clear seam allowance of where you should be stitching. And that way as well, if you cut your binding piece slightly more narrow or slightly wider than you should have, because we're human, then pre-pressing and just using the crease versus using the seam allowance stated will ensure that when you go to fold this all over, it's going to line up perfect for you. Okay? All right, I like to use a lightning stitch, by the way. You must use a sewing machine here. Some people will say they'll use a chain stitch on their cover stitch. I find that it doesn't stretch enough, especially if you're making a youth size. Their heads are pretty large to stretch the neckband over their head. If you're not using a high stretch stitch, it's going to be hard to get over their head. Now, if you're doing an adult, a chain stitch is probably fine, especially if you're doing a lower neckline. This 24/7 take has a high and a low neckline on the front and the back. Even as an adult, if you did the high neckline on the front and the high neckline on the back, it might be hard to get over your head if you're not using a high stretch stitch. It's a pretty fitted tank, and you never want to pop seams. So I use a lightning bolt stitch. It's pretty stretchy and it's pretty narrow. So all I'm going to do is repress where all these creases are. So I'm folding my top raw edge to meet my bottom raw edge, and then folding it down the center crease and pinning it. When I do this, once again, I'm taking the top raw edge, folding it to meet my other raw edge, the bottom raw edge, then folding it over on that center crease. So these are all pre-pressed, and then pinning. And when I pin it down, it should cover up that stitch line we just made. Okay. I like to trim my seam allowance here. You can see I ended up going over with my serger, and honestly, I can't remember why. I like to clip it right there at the center crease, and that way I can nest the seams right here. I just push one to the left and one to the right, so that it just cuts down on that bulk a little bit. Especially if you use a serger, it can get pretty bulky if you leave the entire serged seam allowance all going one way. So you just want to clip through the seam allowance, but not through your stitch line. And we're just going to continue to go around. I highly recommend pinning at your 4 quarter points first. It doesn't have to be perfect, but around the front, around the back, and then the 2 sides first. I don't recommend starting at the back and then moving all the way around, okay, because it is slightly stretched, okay? You want to make sure you're stretching it evenly, and it's a lot harder to make sure you're stretching it evenly if you start at one point and just continue to move around the neckline. If you go in the front and the back and the sides, you've automatically got those points matched up, and then you can slightly stretch in between, and it's much easier to make sure that it's even. If you don't get it even, what's going to happen is you might have a little puckering if you're pulling more on that section, and if you're pulling less on a different section, it might be wavy and not hug to the body. So highly recommend starting off around your quartered points, pinning those first, and then pinning in between those. It's something that you almost always want to do when you're trying to stretch evenly. When you're pinning, you really want to make sure that this bottom fold is covering up your seam allowance. There you go, your stitch line, You don't want to see that first stitch line, so that lightning bolt that I just stitched on our first crease, This bottom fold should be covering it up nice and neatly. Another thing to note here is if your fabric doesn't hold a press very well, you might need to re-press your binding before you pin it. My fabric here, it's a rayon rib knit, held a crease very well. So when I needed to refold it, it folded right into place perfectly for me. If your fabric has lost its creases by the time you're at this step, which we have only sewn it to the neckline, but some fabrics are like that, they just don't like to hold a press, you can re-press exactly the same as we did before so that it's a nice easy fold for you. Okay, and now we're just going to stitch it down. I'm going to use my cover stitch here. You can use any high stretch stitch that you like for top stitching. Usually when I don't use my cover stitch, what I go for is a triple step zigzag. You could do a normal zigzag, whatever you like the look of that has a high stretch, because again, you want it to stretch over that head. Also, this tank top particularly is a very fitted tank top, so it needs high stretch fabric, and I always recommend matching your stitch to your fabric. So if your fabric stretches a whole lot, your stitch should also stretch a whole lot, even if it's not really needed. If you're doing a lower neckline, you don't need to stretch it over your head, and the reason is because it just gets tugged and pulled. At least mine do. You know, when I put it on, when I put it off, I have 3 little ones, so one of my little tinies might grab my neckline and tug on it. And if my stitch always stretches as much as my fabric, I'm never going to pop stitches. So I always like to use a high stretch stitch when I'm sewing high stretch fabrics, even if the garment isn't that fitted in that area. Just a little personal preference there. So when you're stitching this on, you're just top stitching this on, making sure that your binding is staying exactly where you want. You can see I'm kind of pushing it over in some areas to really make sure it's covering that little stitch line that we've already stitched. I don't want that peeking out. I want my stitch right here to be very, very, very close to this folded edge on the front. You do not want to leave much room between that very fold and your stitch line here. You want it on the very edge, a nice edge stitch. If you don't, what's going to happen is it will kind of flip up and you won't be happy with it. So make sure you have it right on the edge of that fold. Now all that's left is one last press around this neckline. You have a beautiful finish on the outside and the inside of your 24/7 tank.